those sorts of things. This is a great topic of interest for many people. If you could take us through your presentation, and we look forward to then discussing it at the finish. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Greg, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I look forward to your questions when we get the chance to discuss. What I'm going to discuss with you today is some research that I started back in 2014, and it took me up until 2022 to complete what was a part-time PhD. And what I was focused on at the time was just trying to understand what China's interests were in Melanesia specifically, but I can talk to more broadly in the Pacific to your questions. Just having a bit of trouble getting my. So I'll just put up the map there to refer to a few places. But in the research that I ended up doing, and I do continue to develop today, I had the privilege of starting my research in China in 2014. Back then, things were very different. It was a very different world. It was we're really just a year into Xi Jinping's first term, and the relationships between my country and your country and China were very different then to what they are now. So I had some amazing opportunities, both as a uniformed army officer and also as a researcher, to talk to people in a number of places, but particularly in Guangzhou and in Beijing, over about 4 different significant visits. But I put up a map there just to describe the case study countries that I then took on. So you can see that the 4 independent states of Melanesia and Timor-Leste, which most people would say is far too many case studies for a PhD, but they all became very relevant to what I was trying to understand. And as I said before, I just wanted to get a feeling for what Chinese strategic interests or just interests in general were in Melanesia at the time. There was no real indication of where they were going to go, or that they would change dramatically while I was doing the research. But that's become the story in the end that I'm going to talk to you about today. Back at the time, there was a number of references, one in particular written by a Chinese New Zealander, Zhang Yang, published in 2011, that really looked at the different interactions China had with the Melanesian countries and the Pacific countries in general, but concluded that there was no great strategic interest from China in this region. And indeed, many academics mirrored those perspectives in academic debate. What then happened over the next 5 years was significant change, which led me to question those original perspectives. So I'm just going to put up there on the screen a few definitions, because I think it's important when we're banding around these terms that I make it very clear what I mean by them. I think all too often there's some kind of dark, shady, suspect kind of intent attached to these terms. I don't see them that way. I put it to you that statecraft and grand strategy are things that almost every country in the world has, regardless of their size. It's just what they do. It's a natural thing for a state to do. So in terms of statecraft being the kind of the mechanisms of how states achieve influence to achieve their grand strategy, there's different ways of categorizing them. And you do need to, when you're doing an analysis, you need certain buckets to put that in. With Chinese statecraft, we tend to talk about political, economic, and security statecraft, and that's what I've done in my research. But I note that when I say political, I could be referring to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who conduct diplomacy, the Department of Propaganda, or the Department of United Front work. And what I concluded midway through my research, largely because of directions from Xi to his departments in Beijing, was that those 3 departments were so close in the way they operated. There was no daylight between any of them, as early as 2017, in the way that they expressed the way they saw the world and the way they worked in the world. So it is, I think, reasonable from an academic perspective to put those together. Economic statecraft is an incredibly important area, which I'll spend some time on, but which probably has the greatest presence and the length of development in each of these countries. But security statecraft is an important one, which has developed far more recently. And it's important to note that when I say that, it's not all about the military, it's not all about the PLA. It's equally, and in fact, in the Pacific, more about police. It's about China's Coast Guard and various other non-military security agencies that contribute to China's security statecraft. And so obviously, when we're looking at how China delivers its grand strategy in Melanesia, which is what my thesis was about, it's how do you employ those different mechanisms or different means together? How do you integrate them to achieve your long-term objectives in that country? Now, the first thing that I asked about when I was in China in 2014 was, it was just a year after Xi Jinping had first talked about what we now know as the Belt and Road Initiative. At the time, it had quite a lengthy name in Mandarin that we summarized as the One Belt, One Road. And I believe that name has never changed in Mandarin, but in English, the Chinese have changed it to the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017. But even as late as 2017, I think there was a lot of confusion as to what this was all about. And one thing that I got told by a number of quite senior Chinese academics who were happy to talk, some of whom were very frank, back in between 2014 and 2017. One of them ended up telling me in 2017 that they had been told to never refer to the Belt and Road Initiative as a strategy. There was obviously a great sensitivity to the word strategy, to the point that when I originally asked Chinese people about China's grand strategy, the answer was, "Oh, we don't have one. We don't use that term. That's like an un-Chinese representation of Western thinking." I then had a particular Chinese academic who I always valued his opinion point out to me that there was indeed a Chinese word for grand strategy, and there had been extensive writings on it. Most of it hadn't made it into English. But with the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, I tend to credit, and I know there's a few codes that I've put on the screen, but if you look at the top right of the screen, that would take you, if you take a photo, it takes you to a book by a French lady called Nadège Roland. And I put it up there because she wrote this in 2017 when people were still pretty unclear as to what the Belt and Road was about. And I think she called it, in my view, she's the first that really put together a clear picture of how this was an integral part of China's grand strategy. But it was effectively in itself a geoeconomic strategy. And when I use that term, I'm talking about the use of economic tools to achieve non-economic outcomes. And another interesting reference is the bottom right of the screen. And that's written by a Chinese general who, so I'm just trying to move some things on my screen. Yeah, that's right, I've got that there. Liu Yazhou wrote this essay, which I recommend to you. It's a short read, and he wrote it in 2001. It was translated into English 2006 or 2007, and that's the version that you'll get by going through that code. But when Liu wrote this essay, it was called The Grand National Strategy. He started out talking about how China, through its economic capacity and in some ways its economic overcapacities, had the means to incorporate the whole of the Eurasian landmass to its west economically and make countries dependent on China's economy. So that was one of his first proposals of what China's grand strategy should be. That really, in many ways, is the original proposition of the One Belt, One Road. Not that his name ever got mentioned or cited in any of these later on concepts. He also, if you go later in the essay, he talks about Southeast Asia. And back in those days, in Chinese writing, quite often Southeast Asia also meant Pacific Islands. But he ends up describing it as the fragmented zone. And really what he's describing is archipelagic Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And he specifically, if you read, there's just a couple of really well-written paragraphs, but he calls out Solomon Islands as one of his key interests. And he talks about how in this zone, it is fragmented politically, culturally, many other ways. And he saw it as an opportunity for China to become involved in these countries and to really divide and rule, I believe were the terms that he used in the end, with the idea you could create a bit of a buffer zone to protect China's core interests. And I think there's a lot of things that Liu wrote that give a bit of clarity to what's happening now, even though they might not have been given a lot of focus back then. And it makes a lot of sense. So between those two references, I think we start to get a picture of what the Belt and Road really is. And I think it's been very successful from a Chinese grand strategic perspective. Now, the other, so I think it's a geo-economic strategy, but it's also become a really useful narrative for how a country that joins the BRI, the narrative then becomes a good reason for why China's statecraft is increased in that country. And then eventually it becomes a framework around which the Chinese ambassador in that country can integrate and adapt his statecraft to achieve the end state, to achieve the long-term objectives for China. The other thing I should add while we've got the map up there, there's a little dark blue line going out to where it says South Pacific Ocean. I actually added that to the map because back at the time, the Pacific had not ever been on the Belt and Road. And so I'm kind of cutting around in the kind of 2015 to 2017 timeframe, talking to senior officials in the Pacific Islands and just saying, hey, do you expect the Belt and Road to come here? Most of them said to me, we would love it to come here because of the proposition of cheap infrastructure, which is another important part of the narrative that attracts developing nations to it. So that universally, all of the ones I spoke to, they said, yeah, bring it on. We'd love it to come here. However, and this is just about everyone I spoke to, they said, it'll never come here because it's meant to be an economic win-win proposition. So if it's meant to be of equal interest economically to China, we are of no economic interest to China. So there's an interesting kind of conclusion that most of these senior officials had come to. I got a similar feel from most of the Chinese academics I spoke to at the time. This is right up to 2017. So it was interesting that in 2018, everything changed in the Pacific. But the path towards it had been pointed out to me by one Chinese academic who said, well, yeah, what everyone's saying to you is correct. There probably isn't a lot of economic reason for China to engage in the Pacific. It's a bit of a one-way street economically. But he said, however, it might not just be economic value that we see in the Pacific. And that kind of bore out in the following year in 2018. So the involvement of China's BRI in the Pacific really started with mid-2018 when Prime Minister Peter O'Neill from Papua New Guinea travelled to Beijing, very intent on getting some support for APEC, and in particular the APEC leaders meeting that was going to happen in November in Port Moresby that year. And having taken on this challenge, I think O'Neill was acutely aware that he was going to have the whole world looking at Papua New Guinea, and he was incredibly concerned that he didn't have the financial backing and capacity to pull it off. So when he got to meet Xi in June, sure enough, he became the first leader of a Pacific nation to sign an MOU for the Belt and Road Initiative. And from there, having spoken to, I should have mentioned before, but the people that I interviewed during my research included a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprise people on the ground as well. And having spoken to the general manager of a couple of these state-owned enterprises from around this time, they did some very intensive work in Papua New Guinea from June through to the leaders' meeting in November. And really, as you all know, China became front and centre in APEC in 2018. And interestingly, by the end of that meeting, all of the other Pacific leaders from countries that recognised Beijing, so therefore the only ones that had the option to join the Belt and Road, had all joined the scheme. And therefore, suddenly you had quite a Belt and Road presence in the Pacific, which then grew in the following year when two countries switched recognition from Taipei to Beijing, that being the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, which was one of the key objectives that China would have had. So if you look at the Belt and Road and 2018, that was a key geopolitical moment for China in the Pacific. So moving on from the Belt and Road, I'll just take you to each of those three areas of statecraft and talk briefly about what I saw change really between 2017 and 2022. It was political statecraft that provided the first evidence. It provided it, but it was not as recognisable at the time. The first understanding I had of what was changing was actually in Dili in early 2017, when I was told by another ambassador about the new Chinese ambassador who just turned up. And she pointed out to me that this guy was a complete change from all the previous Chinese defence attaches over the previous almost 2 decades. And she said the first thing is he's a non-Portuguese speaker. They've always focused on having Portuguese linguists, but generally not particularly high quality in her view. And this guy, he was a very polished English speaker and a very polished diplomat who seemed to be more focused on engaging the ambassadors from all of the other countries in Dili than he was on directly trying to influence the Timorese, which was an interesting change in tack. And she described him as a generational step change in diplomatic capacity. And sure enough, as I moved around the case study countries that year, I saw more evidence of a similar thing. So if you look at your screen, on the right-hand side, the photo in the middle shows you the new Chinese ambassador to Papua New Guinea talking to Peter O'Neill. That's Shui Bing. He arrived in May 2017. I happened to be in Papua New Guinea at the time and remember hearing about this guy almost as soon as he started his job. I think the best way to describe Shui is he's a bit of a smooth operator. And that stood out in comparison to his predecessor and the many before him. But he was definitely an example of this generational step change. It felt like we'd gone from kind of G team representation to somewhere close to the A team in terms of Chinese diplomats in Papua New Guinea. And when you think about what happened on this guy's watch, within a year, that prime minister that he's talking to is the first Pacific leader to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. That must have brought a fair bit of kudos to Shui Bing from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then, more importantly, everything I just told you about happened on Shui Bing's watch and would have been seen as largely influenced by him. So not surprising that when Shui left his post, I think it was 2021, he, I believe, is the first Chinese ambassador to leave a Pacific island and get promoted. And he became China's regional envoy to the Horn of Africa. Sure, you might prefer another region, but the fact is it's promotion, and I'm sure he's done well out of that. Now, if you move to the top left corner of the screen, We have another diplomat that arrived in Fiji, talking to Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama within a month of when Shui Bing arrived. And this guy's name is Chin Bo. And you're probably familiar with the name because he's stayed around. Firstly, I believe he did that job for close to 5 years, which in Australia we'd call performance punishment. I think he was the safe pair of hands. I wouldn't describe him as a smooth operator like Shui Bing. He's far more direct, but he certainly follows the party line and the party's strategy. And I think it's very much trusted in Beijing. And when he finally finished the role, he stayed in Suva as China's regional envoy to the Pacific. So that's why you see his name still pop up now. But once again, a very, very capable diplomat, certainly in comparison to those that went before him. Now, bottom left corner, we have a different chap who turned up a bit later, and that's Li Ming, who's talking to Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare of Solomon Islands. Now, a really interesting thing about Li Ming was I was back at this time, I should have mentioned, all of these diplomats' CVs were available openly online. So you could work out all the jobs that they had done. And I used that as a source of data for my research. Interesting thing about Li Ming was he came straight to this role from being a Deputy Director General in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he was in a division, as they call it, that focused on North American and Oceanian affairs. So they divide the world up into 7 areas. That's one of them. It's probably the biggest one. But what that means is his division looks after all the bilateral relationships for the Pacific. And I'm willing to bet, because it would have probably about 4 or 5 DDGs, not a Navy reference, but Deputy Director General, who would be responsible for a subset of that overall amount of bilateral relationships that the division and the Director General is responsible for. And my guess, of course I can't prove it, is that Li Ming was most likely responsible for the Melanesian states, maybe plus a few others, but would have had a laser-like focus on the developments in the Solomons in 2019, as Manasseh in particular and a number of his colleagues decided to switch their recognition to Beijing. And therefore, it's not surprising that about a year after that switch, you see Li Ming appear in country as the first ambassador, who's sent forward as he's the guy who knows the situation most intimately, but he's also the one that the party trusts and knows what the party wants to achieve. So an interesting example there in Li Ming. The other thing is, at the time, all of the newer ambassadors that turned up, for instance, the one that turned up and replaced Shui Bing and the one that replaced Chin Bo, I started to find that all of them had been a DDG immediately before or 2 postings before they became an ambassador in the Pacific. And to me, that was a bit of a flag. That's a metric. And I use that. I think it's quite powerful because there's far less DDGs, Chinese DDGs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs than there is Chinese ambassadors in the world. So to me, this is a marker of quality, trust, and capability. So what I've just described is, I guess, the most important piece of evidence on China's change in focus on this particular sub-region. And it happened within quite a short period of time. I'll move now to economic statecraft. In many ways, the one that there is the most material on, and I expect I'll get quite a few questions from a number of members of the audience about this. But what I want to focus on is what I found in 2019 in Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu largely. I had done most of my fieldwork in 2017, and a friend of mine in Papua New Guinea was aware of who I'd spoken to in his country. he contacted me in early 2019. He basically said, brother, everything you got in 2017 is no longer valid. You need to come back, which to me was deeply concerning because I was trying to do my write-up and finish this thing. But he convinced me, no, you've got to come back and see what's going on. So about mid-2019, roughly a year after the Belt and Road signature between Papua New Guinea and China, I find myself in Port Moresby for quite a short period of time, but was lucky enough to interview some very knowledgeable Chinese actors on the ground. And they were incredibly open with me about what had happened. The first fact that I found was that the number of Chinese state-owned enterprises in Papua New Guinea, largely in the construction sector, had since mid-2018 had gone up 100%. And that to me I was dumbfounded by that figure, because when I'd been there in 2017, I'd made the judgment you couldn't fit a single extra state-owned enterprise into the Chinese construction sector. Clearly, I was wrong, but they'd now brought in, and this could only be through a decision by the state. It was very focused, brought in twice as many, and it was now dominating all of the contracting in various multinational, multilateral development banks, in particular, in Papua New Guinea's case, the Asian Development Bank. I ended up speaking to leaders of Chinese state-owned enterprises that corroborated this, and the Asian Development Bank corroborated it. One example was that in that year, the Asian Development Bank had 9 different projects happening along what they call the Highlands Highway in Papua New Guinea. Every one of those had a Chinese company delivering it. Now, the interesting thing there was, and talking about economic statecraft, China had donated a lot to the Papua New Guinean economy immediately prior to its entry to the Belt and Road. But as soon as it entered, the amount of money dropped significantly. And if you go to figures like Lowy's Pacific Aid Map, you can track it quite easily, that as the Chinese money closed down, an almost equal increase happened in Asian Development Bank money. So what that means to me is that as the Belt and Road rolled in, it was effectively being paid for by the countries that are donors to the ADB in Papua New Guinea and the World Bank in Vanuatu, as 2 examples. And speaking to a Chinese official at the time, I did ask him, is a Belt and Road Initiative project valid, or is it considered Belt and Road Initiative if it's paid for by another country? And he basically said, oh, we would love that. That's the perfect Belt and Road Initiative project. Chinese company delivering it, paid for by others. And I put it to you, don't have time to go into much more detail on this front, but that is the model that we're seeing in the Pacific now. And I think that has spread. It's far stronger. And the fascinating thing about that is the locals in that country see a Chinese company delivering it, so they agree with that Chinese official. They assume this is part of the Belt and Road, but they assume that that's Chinese money behind that company, when the fact is it's actually coming from Japan, is the leader with Asian Development Bank, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, all countries that might not be really invested in the Belt and Road Initiative and its objectives. So that's a key piece of food for thought, which I'm happy to go into in greater detail in questions, but I won't dwell on because it could take me another day to fully unpack. Now, noting that, I've probably got 6 or 7 minutes. Just moving on to security statecraft. As you know, I was an Army officer when I started this, and there was a period of time where I was in a role as Director of International Engagement for my Army. So I was acutely aware of, I guess, the security relationships that my country had with each of the Pacific countries and that China had as well. And, I'd frequently talk to the Chinese about this kind of stuff back in those days because we could. And it was all far more open. And frankly, there was just not a lot going on from a Chinese perspective back then. It was largely the provision of materiel, the provision of training in China. I actually spent time on what was called a course in Beijing and got to meet the Pacific Islanders who are on a course nearby on the same campus. They weren't very complimentary about the course or the environment that they were in, but they valued the fact that they were getting to understand China, and so did I at the time. But things all changed after the Belt and Road's entry into the Pacific. And I'd say after, because there was a definite time lag between the clear change in priority of political and economic statecraft and then the security statecraft came later. And I guess the first point of difference would have been in 2020, late in the year, well into the period that we now know as COVID-19. We suddenly had defence attaches arrive in Port Moresby and Suva, and everywhere in the Pacific that had a military, suddenly there was some kind of Chinese military representation. And it was interesting because several years before, I used to ask Chinese counterparts, why is it that you have a defence attaché in Dili, but you don't have one in Port Moresby or Suva when those two militaries are bigger than the FFDTL in Timor-Leste? And they'd always say, oh, that's because the Pacific is a low strategic priority to us. So seeing the sudden appearance of defence attaches says to me, well, okay, the strategic priority has changed. But more importantly, as time went on, I was always saying prior to this point, once you see defence attaches, the next thing you're going to see is Chinese police, because it makes far more sense in the majority of Pacific islands that don't have a military to have a connection with the Chinese police. And when you think about it, and with what I've seen in the Solomons, it's probably far more effective at achieving the influence that China wishes to achieve in terms of security statecraft. So what then happened was, after the riots in Honiara in late 2021, China petitioned Honiara persistently to bring in some kind of security force, and eventually it was agreed that they'd bring in a small group of people, a small detachment to run some training. I believe originally it was 2 people, then it grew to 6, and then it ended up being the 9 that you see in that photo on the top left. That's them just after they got off their very large Chinese strategic lift aircraft in Honiara on the 26th of January 2022. And that detachment is still there. So didn't just do the short course that it was advertised to do on riot control. And furthermore, that detachment is now numbered somewhere between 14 and 16, and at times has gusted up to 30 as they've reinforced that element on the ground during a time of perceived potential unrest or concern, security concern from a Chinese perspective. Now, the interesting thing, apart from that group that's obviously in some ways embedded, in some ways mentoring, involved in the RSIPF in the Solomons on the ground, as it's developed its way of operating and then started to hand over to a new contingent every 6 months, then in 2023, an attempt was made to do something similar in Kiribati and Vanuatu. And it started with a group of roughly 6 people turning up, in one case completely uninvited, for a discussion, and they are still there too. They've become detachments that are rotating on a 6-monthly basis. In one case, despite them not really being welcome to start with, they've gradually worked their way. Now, the reason I think this is really significant in terms of security in the Pacific is that those guys and girls, in the Solomons case, have an opportunity to have a direct impact on the rule of law in that country. And that's got to be a very influential thing. One example that I'd call out, which started before the presence that these guys have on the ground is the extraditions that have happened in various parts of the Pacific over the last decade. And the thing I've glided over is that in Fiji, there was a China to Fiji police-to-police relationship that went from 2011 to 2021, in which for a certain part of the year, some Chinese police were embedded in the Fijian police force. And it was during that time that a very significant extradition happened. And I think I had it on my front slide. There was a picture and the top left photo on this slide I've just gone to of the same event. It was where 77 Chinese nationals were extradited from Nadi in 2017 by what seemed like a very large contingent of Chinese police. It was allegedly a joint operation with the Fijian police. And they said that they were all cyber criminals, Chinese cyber criminals, and they were taking them home to sort them out. Investigations later found out that they were all Chinese teenage female sex workers. And we don't know what happened to them. I think a lot of Fijians at the time were pretty concerned about this, that this could happen without an extradition treaty between their countries. And I guess it's a demonstration of what things could look like for other Pacific islands as well. But anyway, just to go back to this slide, this graph, it's a very rough one, which I've published in a chapter on Chinese security statecraft within a book in the last year. But what I'm trying to demonstrate there is the number of major events that have happened in the Pacific, both on the PLA side and on the police side, that contribute to the overall security statecraft effect in Oceania. And you can see that total there, being the green line at the top, has gone up significantly since 2020. And that's really the main point that I'm making. Something's changing. There's got to be a reason for this. So to just look at what all of that means together, if you think of in terms of those three key areas of statecraft from a Chinese perspective, and China trying to deliver its grand strategy in a localized sense in Melanesia and the Pacific more broadly. That map on the right there is one I published in an article in Australian Foreign Affairs about 3 years ago. And it's a dumbed down version of one of the more complex ones in my thesis. But what it really represents there is just the silhouettes show you that China's got the right representation to coordinate and integrate each of those three areas of statecraft on the ground now. But with very much the one on the left, the ambassador, is very much in charge. Once again, that's through Xi Jinping's direction in 2017 that we will speak with one voice, because before that, those other agencies might not have listened to the ambassador, but now it's all very clear how the party wants it to work. What I should have mentioned on my economic slide is there's an economic and commercial counsellor in each of those embassies who's fundamental to the coordination of economic statecraft. And as part of that, he or she is the main person coordinating the Belt and Road in that country. But when you look at how those three different arms work together, it's integration, but it's also adaptation. And the good diplomats know how to adapt to what's appropriate for the local narrative, what's appropriate to local needs, and therefore are better at achieving China's grand strategic objectives as they proceed. The final thing, noting I'm on time, just got to quickly mention, I did spend a vast amount of my time talking to Pacific Islanders, and that's hardly come up in what I've said to you today. I also didn't mention I did 297 interviews, which is fairly unusual for a PhD. But what I found talking to Pacific Islanders, both at the official level but also at the grassroots level, is reflected in the essay that you get to through that icon at the bottom there, which is by Apelli Halfa. written in 1993 called Our Sea of Islands. And I was lucky enough to be pointed to this essay before I started. But there's a page or two where Apelli points out that how things operate in the Pacific from his perspective. And he said, you've got to understand things all happen on at least two levels. And he talked about the national level, where we talk about security and we have officials, we have politicians, we have advisors, and we talk about the national interest. But then he said, just keep in mind at the grassroots level is where most of the people are, and they have to live every day. And they make decisions based on their personal interests or their family's interests or their tribe's interests that may have absolutely no bearing or connection to what's happening at that national level. And I guess I took that a step further in my research, and I tended to describe four levels that I've put on the screen there. And I just applied it to a few situations where I ended up living in a village in, say, Papua New Guinea, and coming to understand the local perspectives on a Chinese mine that was just near it. You could go to that one place and look at what the interests were on all four levels, and none of them would marry up. And so you have this problematic situation in the Pacific in many places where you just can't assume that by negotiating with one set of interests that you're going to meet the others. And there's always this underlying risk that it's going to lead to a lot of other problems. And this is no matter who you are. If you're an outsider, you're at risk, whether you're Australian, Chinese, New Zealand. And I think each of the countries in their own time has started to learn this lesson. But the more recent arrival is China. And so they're the ones getting the focus right now. And when we have riots in places like the Solomons, they tend to be an easy target. So just a few elements of nuance I wanted to add at the end. But Greg, over to you.
Thanks very much, Pete. It's stimulated a number of questions throughout. So I'll start off by asking, has Australia and New Zealand and the US been asleep at the wheel to enable this shift of priority to be able to happen in our backyard?
That's a good question, mate. And I guess it reflects the way a lot of media reporting looks at it. I don't think that anyone's been asleep at the wheel. I think it's an incredibly complex situation where, firstly, you've got to look at the agency of the host nation, and which I've just touched on very briefly, the sheer complexity of that. Whose agency are we talking about? And so not an easy thing to affect, not an easy thing to, if a decision's been made to engage with a country, it's not like another country can stop that. But secondly, the way that China has, I guess, effectively increased its involvement, which to me indicates a change in strategic priority, started with economic means, which were always going to be of interest to those countries, to most of them being developing nations. So once again, I mean, it's not something you could stop, or in my view, you should stop. There's certain things about it that are beneficial to the host nation. The issue to me is awareness of what comes with it, because it's heavily sold as no strings attached. Well, I'm here to tell you there's a hell of a lot of strings, and I'm getting to know quite an amount of people in the Pacific that really understand that. And if they do understand it, they can make it work better for them, frankly. And that's important. But the premise that Australia could stop this, I think is ludicrous. I don't think that was ever likely. And there's too many different things going on And if you took a view that, well, we've just got to stop it, then you'd really be missing the point, and you'd probably make it worse. But
You,
no one's really done that, and I think yeah, it's looking at individual issues and looking at what's good and what's bad from a host nation perspective. I think what our countries should be doing.
so you mentioned the no strings attached. That there was a question. What is the core interest in, let's say, the Solomon Islands or other islands? When you said earlier, it sort of seems to be a one-way traffic scenario of assistance in that. What is the long game? What is the bigger objective of this all? It leads to what?
Yeah, so Solomon's been a good example. I guess the stronger China's influence can be over Solomon's political class to determine what China can do in the region, particularly what it can do in the Solomons that then affects the region. They're part of the long game for China. So I think to them, it's worth the investment, particularly when the investment ends up being paid for by your competitors, as it increasingly is. But from a Chinese perspective, it's about being able to have that influence and that presence and that access, as well as I put this much lower down list, resources, particularly from Papua New Guinea, but increasingly from the Solomons and Fiji and Vanuatu. Those are the key interests, I guess, that China was looking for. Does that answer your question?
I think so. It comes to this thing, the question of grand strategy, and you've looked at this grand strategy. Could you consider it comparable to, say, a Russian expansionist view, or are there other countries you could compare it to that? And therefore, where does it lead?
Sure. I think it doesn't compare to Russia in that Russia tends to be a bit more myopic in how they pursue grand strategy, and that they're far more into hard power. I mean, they've come up with very interesting ways of using propaganda and influence, which I think China has learnt from. But at the same time, China will tend to nuance it more than Russia, and tend to look for a lot more than what Russia does in terms of their influence. But overall, I guess so I've talked about the key interests that China has being, firstly, what I was describing before is geopolitical influence. That's how I'd summarize it. But secondly, geostrategic access, and thirdly, the resource accumulation. The one out of that people tend to ask, why is the geostrategic access, and it's this basing thing, which I think is wildly misunderstood in media representation. But it does have a very clear basis to it, and that is, from my reading, in 2016, a Chinese admiral made it very clear in an article that he wrote that the party had directed the PLA to go and find a base in the Pacific and another in the Indian Ocean. And that happened probably around 2012. It happened around a time of a great internal debate in the PLA. Well, how do you make this work? And at the time, I think the conclusion was, well, the only way we're going to do it or come close to it is a dual use facility. You can't just go having an actually Chinese branded base. But so the whole idea there was to be able to project power in keeping with China's growth as a world power. But in terms of the posture that China seeks to have in the Pacific, I can give you 5 ideas or 5 objectives behind what China would be trying to achieve. The first one has been it's wanted to penetrate the first island chain and demonstrate its presence beyond that. The second one was to then expand beyond the second island chain, and that puts us in the Pacific. The third is really to displace its major competitors, or competitor really is the US. The fourth is to posture effectively for if there is conflict. And I say if because I don't think either competitor wants a conflict. And hearing what Trump said yesterday, that reinforces it. That's good. But the fact is, China is rapidly preparing for if there is one, which sadly makes conflict more likely. An interesting conundrum. And the final one is control. And when you think about what I was talking about with the police and the kind of interaction of police forces in various countries, they've attempted similar things in a number of Western countries as well. I think in the end, there's a very long game where China sees itself in a far more controlling position in our region.
I guess leads on to what will probably be the final question. Is recently we've seen the Chinese Navy exercising in the Tasman. We've had the interactions shifting with the Cook Islands as a major partner in financing there, so this continuing expansion. What do you, and for New Zealand particularly, 50% of our export market is into China, and similarly with imports. What do you see as the future in the midterm as to how this keeps playing out?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it, Greg?
It's the big question.
The big question. I think at the moment, I look at it along the three lines of statecraft, really, the three lines of action. But I think, politically, the level of priority will be maintained with a view to having more influence over the Pacific Island Forum, in a way, divide and rule within the forum, so that it's not something that China has difficulty influencing. And as part of that, if it could possibly get those other three Pacific Islands to switch recognition to Beijing, it would love to. So the diplomatic effort will continue in line with what I described earlier. On the economic front, it's an interesting one, but I use it as a term of equilibrium. You can only put so many state-owned enterprises in. I obviously misjudged that with Papua New Guinea, but I think they've now reached that point where you couldn't do a lot more. But certainly, those efforts continue. What's happening in the Solomons, for instance, there's a vast amount of work being done pretty much by one state-owned enterprise, China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation, that really didn't have a presence in Solomons until a year or two before the switch, and now it's everywhere. So I'd imagine, the premise of the Belt and Road as a geoeconomic strategy continues, and that continues to be a way to affect and influence the Pacific Islands. And then finally, on the security front, and as you mentioned, those examples, the one that no one ever mentions is that little ICBM that got popped into the middle of the waters, the international waters in the middle of Kiribati late last year, which I think shocked a lot of Pacific Islands that China would do that. It certainly didn't shock me. But that, to me, is a more significant thing than the flotilla that went around Australia. But in either case, it's demonstrating intent in lines which I went into in greater detail before.
Look, thanks very much, Pete, for taking the time today to join us and share your research. Definitely insightful and a huge conversation, and I know you could talk at length on that. And there's a lot for people to digest in there, and so we'll make your slides available so that people can click onto those links and be able to follow up with further reading. But it's always interesting, we sit sometimes watching the markers here and there, but the research that you've done into the patterns, the indicators, and the detail, that certainly gives a a detailed insight and pattern as to what is actually occurring is fascinating. So thank you very much again on behalf of all of us. As I said, the PDF of the slides will be made available for further reading of the links, and we also will share the recording in due course. And please join us in the future for other topics on strategic insights and indicators. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Pete.